Rich MacLaren for the Thursday Reformed Fellowship. We are a group of folks who meet on Thursday mornings at the A&N Diner in Sellersville and have a conversation around the breakfast table on points of theology. Today we were considering the biblical doctrine of original sin, and we'll talk about that for a bit here on the video as well. I would note that our ministry is an offshoot of First Church in Perkasie, Pennsylvania, and we'd encourage you to come by for a visit sometime soon. Our services currently begin at 9:30 in the morning. We may be undergoing a change fairly soon. We'll let you know about that, but just be aware to check to make sure if you come for a visit that our time schedule hasn't changed. At the moment we're at 9:30 on Sunday mornings. We may be moving to 11 o'clock for our Sunday morning service, so just a heads up on that, some changes on the way. And two, around First Church, our building, we are getting new landscaping done. We're going to get a whole new look to the church. We're getting our windows painted, repaired and painted, so we're going to have a very nice looking new building in some respects for the Perkasie community. The building itself was established in 1911 as a Mennonite church, Bethel Mennonite Church, and over the years it has evolved, if you will, theologically, spiritually, into the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. So that's quite a journey, but it's one congregation that over time has confessed faith in Jesus Christ. So here we are today, 2019, and our conversation this morning is on the nature of original sin. Now we need to understand a little bit about what the Bible means when it talks about sin and its impact on humanity. One of the things that will become immediately apparent if you open the newspaper, if you still do that in the morning, or if you go online and check your website app for news, you'll find that there is plenty going on in the world to show that the nature of man is essentially evil. And that is getting to the heart of what original sin refers to. Our nature is basically evil. That's the testimony of Scripture with regard to our human nature. There's none righteous, no, not one. None who understands, none who seeks for God. They've all become corrupt. That's the testimony of the psalmist in the Old Testament, and it's repeated by the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 3. So there is a united, consistent testimony to the corruption of our human nature. Paul says again in Ephesians chapter 2 that we are dead in trespasses and sins. That is to say that our nature is thoroughly given over to sin, to wickedness, and is dead to the life of God, dead to the service of God. It will not respond to God. It will not hear His call. It will not respond to the gospel message. It is dead in trespasses and sins. You can read about that in Ephesians chapter 2. In Romans chapter 8, going back there, you find that Paul talks about the great conflict that occurs between the flesh and the spirit. And the flesh, which has its mind, or the mind of man who's set on the flesh, is a mind set on death. And that flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit itself to God. And indeed, as Paul says, it is unable to submit to God. Our human nature is corrupted by sin, and that sin affects all of our nature, body and soul. Every aspect of our thinking, our choices, our desires have all been corrupted and polluted by sin, are enslaved by sin, and are incapable of doing anything good in God's sight. Now that's a rather sweeping judgment that the Scriptures make of our fallen human nature. Where does this arise from? Well, Well, we can go back to the book of Genesis, and there at the very beginning we see the creation of the heavens and the earth, and God creates Adam and Eve, places them in the Garden of Eden, and creates them good. They are able to do that which is right and obedient before God. Their nature was untainted by sin in any way. But we know, of course, that by the 3rd chapter, Satan comes into the garden through the serpent and tempts Eve to eat of the fruit that was forbidden them by God. And so Eve eats of that forbidden fruit. She gives it to Adam, and he, knowing the circumstances and all that is involved in it, nonetheless ate the fruit with his wife Eve. And so they sinned against God, and that brought God's judgment upon Adam and Eve and all of their children, all of humanity. And so, descending from Adam and Eve, we see the development of sin within the human race. And all you have to do is look through the first handful of chapters of Genesis. Genesis 4 opens up with Cain slaying, murdering his brother Abel. And you find all kinds of violence in that early world. You do find that Enoch walked with God, and he was not. It's not to say that he was a perfect man, but he trusted in God, and God was pleased to take him from this world. Noah found favor in God's sight, and so Noah was spared when God came to judge what we call the antediluvian world, the world before the flood. And so Noah was found favor in God's sight. But the rest of the world was condemned because of its sin. In Genesis chapter 6, you can read about how God takes a look at humanity, and it's nothing but evil. And so he decides to condemn the world, but save it through Noah and his family. And so the original sin refers to what occurred in the Garden of Eden. Now, original sin does not simply refer to the first sin committed by our first parents, Adam and Eve, the eating of the forbidden fruit. It refers to the sinful nature that's passed on to us from our first parents. Now, I think it's pretty plain that our nature is evil, although we have many today, particularly those who are of the progressive social justice mindset, who see that there are systemic evils in the world today that occupy our institutions of government and media and so forth. And so the role of the social progressive is to try to address these social institutions. This is very much something out of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's French Revolution, and the assertion that it's our environment that's the problem. People are basically good, but the environment is problematic. And because there are evil institutions, we need to address those rather than dealing with the human heart. We see that today in the gun control movement. Now, certainly there's a place for laws about guns and the use of guns. Not everyone should have access to a gun. Those who are unstable emotionally, mentally, probably should not have guns. At the same time, you can see in the broader movement at gun control and the end game being gun confiscation, as has already become apparent in some of the comments made by Democratic presidential candidates. The end game is gun confiscation, because it seems like if we eliminate the gun, then we will reduce crime. It's like the war on poverty. If we reduce poverty and bring everybody up to a level of equality in the world, financially speaking, lifestyle speaking, then we will eliminate much of the cause for crime by alleviating poverty. So these are efforts to change the environment without real recognition that the problem of our community is the problem of the heart. And so if you take our guns away, people will still murder neighbors, friends, even family members, using other means, bombs, buses, cars, airplanes, baseball bats, a wide range of ways in which people will express their murderous intent. And truthfully, any law to take away guns will take it away from law-abiding people, but of course criminals are not law-abiding people. So you disarm the community, make them defenseless before the criminal. And the criminal has a free shot at whoever he wants. That's why the gun-free zones are not very effective. They seem to be a magnet towards those with guns. They go to them because they figure they're not going to get somebody shooting back at them, which would be a deterrent. In any case, the evil of the world around us is not just in the institutions. There's no doubt systemic evil. There's no doubt structural evil. But it's only reflective of what's in the human heart. And it's the human heart that needs to be addressed, and the basic evil and corruption of that human heart. And so that's what we need to be focused on. Now the Bible says that Adam was our first parent, and in Adam we all sinned. So when he ate of the forbidden fruit, he did not do so as a private individual, just acting out his own sin, as though he could have told a lie, or he could have been jealous or something. No, this was a sin against God, and a specific prohibition that God had given to him, and he acted as the federal head and representative of all of humanity. God was so pleased to arrange our relationship to Adam that he acted on our behalf there in the garden. And so because he sinned, we have inherited the guilt of that first sin. So that in Adam, you and I are also responsible for that act of rebellion against God. And we show our union with Adam in that rebellion by the very personal individual sins that we ourselves commit. Now the Bible is very clear that we are sinners from the very beginning of life. In Psalm 51, David speaks of how he was conceived in iniquity. So from the very beginning of his life, David was aware that sin had so corrupted him that there was no escape from its influence. Now our men had a conversation around the table today about the Roman Catholic view of original sin. And it was pointed out that the Roman view of original sin and its impact on us is that through baptism, the baptism of infants, that original sin is removed. That doesn't mean that a child is perfect and incapable of sin, but it just means that the child is free of the guilt of that sin and is now enabled to be an innocent individual, to live a good life. And so in many respects, in the Roman view, with baptism removing original sin, and then childhood as a period of innocence until the age of reason develops in the child, about age 12, 13, 14, where the child can make decisions for itself. That period of time is a period of time of innocence in the Roman Church. And so the impact of original sin is removed. In many respects, what the Roman Church is doing is taking us back to the time of Adam and Eve in the garden, where they are able not to sin. They're able to do that which is good. Now, in Rome, they don't put them completely back into that position, but they do recognize that there's an impact, a loss of a special relationship with God from the very beginning, but they in many respects make people morally neutral and able to respond to God. And that's consistent with their point of view. Their theology is really at least semi-Pelagian, if not entirely Pelagian in nature. It recognizes the ability of a man to do that which is good, at least at some level. The mind of man is not tainted and corrupted by sin, is not totally depraved. Rather, man's reasoning is still sound and good, and he can still make good decisions. In their view, this is necessary so that we can have a free will. Our will isn't free if our mind is bound by sin. Well, that really doesn't hold now, does it? If our nature is corrupted and polluted by sin, that will affect the way we think. Jesus himself said that out of the heart flow all of the different sins, fornications, adulteries, lies, envy, all these things, blasphemies. These come from the heart. It's the heart of man, the inner source of life within our humanity, that is corrupted and polluted by sin. And so you cannot bifurcate or distinguish or set off man's reasoning apart from his will and emotions, or at least his emotions, and say that the will is free to make sound decisions. The scriptures actually make plain that man is corrupted through and through. The heart is corrupted, given entirely over to sin, and that affects every dimension of our humanity, including our mind or intellect. And so, as we pointed out last time, Paul says in Romans chapter 3 that there's none who understands, there's none who seeks for God. That's the aspect of the mind, the intellect, and then that of the will as well. None who understands, none who seeks for God. And so, from Paul's point of view, from the point of view of Scripture, our intellect is corrupted, polluted by sin. And it's engaged in all kinds of idolatrous thoughts, beliefs, ideas. Paganism is an idea that roots itself in our mind, and it persuades us to think that nature is divine. Nature has a spark of divinity in it, and so we should worship nature. The evolutionary process is another form of rebellion against God and what God says about the world. He is the creator. We didn't just arrive on our own. So we are corrupted through and through. Every aspect of our being has been corrupted by sin. And that's because of our union with Adam. In Adam, all die. And so in Romans 5, the Apostle Paul develops that for us, and he shows how in Adam we have all died. Death passed throughout all of humanity, even before the giving of the law. Sin was present there before the Ten Commandments arrived, because death was there present from the Garden of Eden up through the flood, up until Moses, and thereafter, of course. And so why was death present in the world from the very start? Well, it's only because people were sinners. God does not put the righteous to death. Jesus would not have died on the cross were it not for the fact that he was our substitute and he bore our sin. Apart from that, you could not put him to death because he was righteous in God's sight and God would not allow it. And so why do people sin from Adam through the flood and thereafter? Well, it's because they are sinners. And it's for that reason that they are put to death. And so the record, you can see from the early chapters of Genesis and the genealogies that are recorded there is a recurring theme. So-and-so lived 500 years, 700 years, 900 years. He had so many sons, and he died, one after the other. They died. You can see God was faithful to his word at the very beginning. In the day that you eat thereof, from that forbidden fruit, you will die. And that has occurred immediately. So, Adam was the federal head and representative of our humanity. There is another federal head and representative of humanity, and that is Jesus Christ. If you have a problem with the fact that God appointed Adam to be the head and representative of humanity, and his actions in the Garden of Eden had an impact on you, then you should also consider that your salvation depends on that same principle of representation. Adam's sin was imputed to you, but Christ is the second Adam, and his righteousness may be imputed to you as well by faith. His redemption may be given to you. His work of righteousness may be given to you, and that through faith. And so the principle of representation is essential to our salvation, even as it is essential for explaining the world around us and the presence of sin within us. It's because of our union originally with Adam in his sin. You might think of it this way: in the course of history, you always have certain leaders who make decisions on behalf of those who are, for whom they are responsible. So the king or the president makes a decision for the country, and the country follows through with that. We have a decision to go to war. Well, the president declares we are at war, we are at war. And so everyone within the nation now must join in the war effort. Similarly, the nation with which we are at war fights not just against the president who made the declaration, but against all of us, because we are united with our president. And so there is a sense of corporate responsibility there within the civil sphere. The civil authority makes decisions for which we are all accountable. Similarly, within the family, the head of the family, the husband, the father, makes decisions on behalf of his family. He may decide to move the family. He may decide to bring the children out of the public school and put them into a Christian private school. He may make a wide variety of decisions. What kind of car are they going to ride around in? What home are they going to live in? All kinds of things are made by the father as the final decision made within the family. He certainly makes that in consultation with his wife, and together they come to a decision that they both agree upon. But in the end, it's the father's decision. He makes that decision, and the family moves along with that decision. And we bear the consequences of that decision. So there is a kind of federal headship that works its way out through all of life. A business owner makes decisions not just for himself, but for everybody within the business. Federal headship, corporate responsibility, that's something that is part of every aspect of our lives. And so here we have a description of our union with Adam in his original sin, and we have hope in view of the Christ, the second Adam, whose righteousness now replaces that of Adam's disobedience. You can read more about that in Romans chapter 5, where Paul talks about how the sin of Adam was passed on in death through sin to all of humanity. But Christ, through his one act of righteousness, brought life to all who are included in him. And so there are two heads of humanity, Adam and the second Adam, Jesus Christ. Adam brought sin and death into the world. Christ brings life and obedience into the world by his own act of obedience before the Father. So this is the concept of original sin. And it explains much that we see in the world around us. When we were talking about the Roman view of original sin, I made the point that if in the Roman view, original sin is taken care of by the baptism of an infant, and that there's a period of innocence until the child arrives at an age of reasoning, how is it that during this infancy and childhood experience, the child displays sinful habits? The child lies, the child gets angry, the child is rebellious. He said one of the first things he learns to say is no. Maybe he's imitating his parents, but when the parent tells him no, but he's saying no, he will not do what his parent wants him to do. That's rebellious. There's sin bound up within that heart. The child does not have the same level of responsibility for his actions as an adult does, but it's still sinful actions for which it is accountable. And what explains that sinful action, that sinful tendency, is the presence of original sin, our union with Adam. If original sin is removed, then the child would not be given itself over to those kinds of sinful actions, lying, stealing, bouts of anger and rage and these kinds of things, rebellion against parental authorities, school authorities, and so forth. These things would not be present in a child that does not have Adam's original sin and the sinful nature inherited from Adam. Obviously, the child does have that, and so the child still has original sin, despite what Rome says with regard to baptism taking away or removing original sin. We do not believe that baptism itself removes original sin just by the action of that. Baptism points us to Christ and to union with him in his death, so that through him we have the forgiveness of sins, including original sin and everything. But it comes through us in Christ, and our original sinful nature remains in us, though weakened as a Christian. It remains in us until we pass from this life. And it's only in the next life that we are entirely set free from sin and given new natures that faithfully, obediently, perfectly, and unendingly, permanently live in obedience to God. So that is the work of Christ for us, and how thankful we should be that that is the future laid up for the children of God. Well, I think I'll finish here with our conversation on original sin. I hope that it is of help to you in formulating your own view of the world and of our human nature. People are basically evil and not basically good. Those who say that man is basically good, you can find in our politics and the progressive movement that says people are basically good. We just need to transform society and to help them perfect themselves. No, the problem is with the human heart. It is sinful and evil, and it needs to be remedied, and the only remedy for that is conversion, faith in Jesus Christ, a new life in him. Well, this is Pastor MacLaren for First Church in Perkasie, Pennsylvania. I want to encourage you to come and visit us. Our services are held on the corner of 5th and Race Streets. They begin currently at 9:30. We may be having a change fairly soon to 11 o'clock, so watch for that. But we'd love to have you come and join us. God bless and take care. Bye.